So welcome everyone to today's FinEquity webinar. My name is Dezso. I'm the working group lead at FinEquity of the Data and Measurement Working Group. And this webinar really is a collaboration between the Data and Measurement workstream and the Social Norms workstream at FinEquity, and my colleague Nisha Singh, who leads the Social Norms Working Group, is here as well and is helping me a lot with a lot of the behind the scenes tasks that are needed to put the webinar together today. And just to give you a little bit of context of where this webinar fits within the work of FinEquity, within the Data and Measurement Working Group, over the past year, we've been working on a mapping of women's economic empowerment measurement tools that are relevant for financial inclusion, in response to our community's interest to go beyond traditional measures of access, usage, changes in income, and assets and other economic indicators when designing and measuring outcomes of financial inclusion initiatives. And we found that elements of agency are present in all of these measurement tools. At the same time, when it comes to women's agency, the starting point, the baseline, or what is even feasible to measure, what outcomes we can expect to influence, are all very much influenced by gender norms and attitudes on gender norms. So that's the connection with the Social Norms Working Group at FinEquity. And today we have with us two fantastic speakers, Mikaela Rabb, who is a policy associate at JPAL, where she works on the gender and finance sectors, and Anna Mecagni, who is Senior Director for Program Design and Development at Women for Women International. Anna and Mikaela, thank you so much for joining us today. And before we start, just to say that, oops, I'm sorry, my new AirPods fell, all right. Just to start that today's discussion draws from two recent publications, and we'll post the links to these publications in the chat box, but also you will have it available at the end of the webinar. The first one is a review of practical tools and frameworks for measuring women's agency in women's economic empowerment. And this resource came together based on tools and resources and information shared by practitioners within the Women's Economic Empowerment Working Group at SEEP and from other sources. And then the second publication, that's the basis of today's discussion, is a review of evidence that draws from around 160 RCTs and quasi-experiments, and it discusses the existing evidence on what supports women's agency. And again, I invite you to read these two resources. There are fantastic resources for everyone in the field, but today's discussion will focus on applications to women's financial inclusion, and especially we will focus on definitions of women's agency, measurement aspects, domains, indicators, measurement frameworks, and also what financial inclusion interventions enhance women's agency. And I would like to invite everyone when we will have a Q&A portion at the end of the discussion, but also please post your questions to the panelists in the Q&A box. And also, if you want to direct your question to one of the speakers, mention that, and then at the end we will facilitate a conversation based on your questions. And if we don't have a chance to answer or address all your comments or questions today, we will follow up with everyone who registered and answer those questions on our platform in B groups, and I'll send you more information about how to join that platform. So we can get started with the first question on definitions, and this question is for Anna. How is women's agency defined and measured in the frameworks and resources that you have reviewed?
Thanks, Diana. Thank you so much for this opportunity and those great opening remarks. I'm thrilled to be here and happy to share some learning that came through in this SEEP resource that myself and two colleagues, Mansi Anand and Mariam Piracha of the SEEP Network's Women's Economic Empowerment Working Group put together and released a couple of months ago. So in the SEEP agency brief, we looked at measurements of agency within women's economic empowerment frameworks, and it's helpful to share a few thoughts about those and then get into the nitty-gritty of some of the case studies that we highlighted in the brief. So many of the existing women's economic empowerment frameworks or frameworks that we found that were already existing come back to Naila Kabir's seminal Resources, Agency, and Achievement. And Kabir defines empowerment as the process by which those who have been denied the ability to make choices acquire such an ability. And agency, of course, is a part of that process. The process of empowerment involves resources or preconditions, agency as the process, and achievements as outcomes. And Kabir defines agency in particular as the ability to define one's goals and act upon them. So when we think about agency, and women's agency in particular, it involves increasing participation, voice, negotiation, influence in decision-making about strategic life choices. And those life choices could be around livelihood, where to move, whom to marry, and whether to have children. And those concepts of agency are not easy to measure, as you can imagine, but they do exist. And in this brief, we dig into existing evidence on agency measurement and then profile case studies from practitioners across the SEEP network who contributed their organization's methods of measuring agency. And so for existing evidence, we looked at a number of resources, and please note that this was before Jay Powell's excellent new resource on agency, which I encourage you to read. But we highlight in this brief the World Bank's Measuring Women's Agency Policy Research Working Paper, the Emerge Project, which is at the University of California at San Diego. We looked at ICRW's WE framework, the WEA, the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, and then more macro levels of measurements like the SIGI, Social Institutions and Gender Index, and global data sets like the UN Women's Data Set on Violence Against Women. And looking at these existing resources and the case studies that we collected, we found that different organizations measure agency in different ways. That could be through different levels of agency, individual, household, community, system structures, norms. That includes ICRWs and UCSDs, through different dynamics within and between the self and others. In terms of a process of agency toward the future state, and the World Bank lays out a really interesting methodology to measure that progress towards goals. And then more traditional economic development outcomes like savings, income, et cetera, or some combination of these. And so this morning, during this webinar, we will look at 3 ways that practitioners measure agency that are highlighted in the brief. First one is different levels, second one is agency within broader WE frameworks, and the third is self-defined agency. So the first set of cases looked at measuring different levels of agency. So existing frameworks include ICRW and UCSD, and the brief includes 2 from practitioners. So Women for Women International, which is the organization that I work with, as well as the William Davidson Institute, WDI, at the University of Michigan. At Women for Women, our focus is on gender equality and women's empowerment, and we consider agency and its measurement intrinsically linked to all of our social and economic outcomes. So we use a standard survey tool, and we measure agency at different points, at baseline, end line, 1 year, and 2 year after graduating from the program. And the examples on the screen show different measures of agency at different levels. And we try and grasp these various expressions of agency, whether at the individual, household, or collective levels. The main takeaways for this kind of methodology of measuring agency at different levels is that agency is quite complex. So more standard quantitative measures, like the ones shown here, might benefit from being paired with qualitative perspectives that capture more nuance and detail. Also, these measures assume a common understanding of agency, which may not translate to all languages and cultural contexts. The next set that we'll look at on the next slide are agency within broader WE frameworks. And the two that are highlighted in the brief are from Market Development Facility, MDF, which is highlighted here, as well as Palladium's WE framework. And so across the different frameworks, we found that there are quite common domains of change that these different frameworks are trying to measure. That includes labor participation, frequency, stability, and choice of employment, entrepreneurship and participation in women's collectives, financial inclusion, engagement with and use of financial resources like banking, savings accounts, digital services, etc., control over assets or assets ownership, measuring of decision-making control, workloads, division of labor, and violence against women. The MDF example that you see on the screen is illustrated in the form of a spider graph, so implementers can see movement over time, positive and negative movement over time in these different domains. And so that can provide practitioners with an informative tool to monitor progress, identify risk, design better interventions, and capture the impact on the lives of women and their economic empowerment. So these types of measurements are great as they think about a woman holistically and her journey towards economic empowerment across various factors. However, it's also challenging because it might be difficult to separate out specific agency-specific measurement from more typical economic outcomes in these kinds of frameworks. And then finally, I'll share the case of women or communities that define agency themselves. So this is self-definition of agency, and JPAL actually recommends this approach in undertaking formative qualitative work to define agency metrics. So the example on the screen is from MEDA's Jordan Valley Links project, which offers a method of self-defining agency through an adaptation of CARE's gender progress markers, their GPM approach, where women define what an empowered woman is, like this description on the screen. Similarly, AWEF, the Arab Women's Enterprise Fund, which is also highlighted in the brief, developed a tailored qualitative research process based on focus groups conducted at the start of the program for women to tell a story about what an empowered woman is and to make markers against that story. So the main takeaways for this approach of measuring self-defined agency is that it's a really strong approach. It better reflects context, culture, norms, and individual perceptions of agency. However, it's highly subjective. And so it may be difficult to compare across individuals, communities, contexts, as well as to standardize to higher level outcomes. And it also might require highly trained staff, which we'll get into in a discussion a little bit later. So happy to share more in the Q&A and delighted to be here. Thank you so much.
And before we move on to the next question, we have a participant poll related to the domains of women's agency. And I hope you can see that question on your screens. What are the domains of agency most likely to be influenced by financial inclusion initiatives and how? Actually, what we wanted to ask you is what domains of women's agency do you measure in your programs? So take a minute, half a minute to answer this question. What domains of agency do you measure in your programs? If that's the case, you can select everything that applies. And we will then share the results with everyone, and maybe Anna can compare and contrast what they found in the review of the frameworks submitted through the working group and what we hear from you today in terms of what are the domains that you are looking at in your programming. Just a few more seconds to to type your answers. And Nisha, if you see that we have most of the participants responding, please close the poll and share the results when it's time. All right. Yeah, we close the poll, and Nisha, if you can share the results, and Anna, if you can take a quick look and see how the responses are clustering, and how does this compare to the findings in the tools that and the case studies that you reviewed. Anna, are you able to see the results?
Yeah, really interesting. And maybe in the Q&A with Mikaela, we can talk about some of these, but definitely similar issues. It's interesting. Household decision-making comes up really high, as well as control over assets. Household decision-making is notoriously difficult to measure. So, you know, maybe we can get into a bit of a robust conversation about that. Same thing with control over assets. If it's individual or household assets, those are quite difficult also to measure, but really interesting to see what's popping up. I find it quite interesting that violence against women isn't being measured that much, although that is also requires a highly trained staff to measure. And workloads and division of labor, interesting to see that those aren't measured as much. So yeah, it looks like an interesting mix, and maybe we can get into some of the details in the Q&A.
Absolutely, thank you, Anna. So our next question, my next question is for Mikaela, and from the review of evidence, we would like to learn a little bit more about, you know, what domains of agency are most likely to be influenced by financial inclusion initiatives, and how?
Thank you so much for the question, Diana, and thank you to Nisha, Nisha, for inviting me to speak today and organizing this webinar. Good morning, everyone, and thank you also for joining this webinar. Looking forward to a really lively conversation with you all. So I'm excited to share some of the top findings from our recent literature review on women's agency. So in this review, there seems to be no clear pathway between financial inclusion initiatives and specific domains of agency. Instead, women express agency gain from financial inclusion initiatives in many different ways. Economic interventions can have effects on women's agency beyond the economic domain. So for instance, an evaluation looked at an intervention in India that deposited payments from a government workfare program directly into women's accounts. Plus, they also train women on how to use these accounts. This intervention was found to increase women's labor force participation and also improved attitudes about women working. However, this intervention had no effect on women's role in decisions about her employment or spending and her earnings. Likewise, this intervention also had effects beyond the economic domain. Despite no changes in decision-making, the intervention also enhanced mobility for women facing the most caste-based social restraints. These results are not intuitive, just as the ways women express agency are not straightforward. Today, I want to shed light on the many ways women express agency and discuss what financial inclusion initiatives work and don't to enhance women's agency. So next slide. So before diving into the findings, I want to give a bit more background on our literature review process and the different domains of agency we examined. Agency is inherently multifaceted. Many existing reviews have focused on one outcome or one intervention type. While these reviews are interesting and informative in of itself, a unique contribution of this review is its cross-cutting approach, looking at agency across many different domains. So we drew from Laszlo et al.'s 2017 framework for direct and indirect indicators of agency to identify 11 indicators of agency that we focus on in this review. Today, I'll focus on the domains most relevant to financial inclusion initiatives, mainly household decision-making, labor force participation, and income generation entrepreneurships, many of the ones that were highlighted in the survey response. But as the example on the previous slide illustrated, financial inclusion initiatives can have effects in many different domains of agency, and thus I will also touch upon some of these other domains. In total, that's perfect. One of our main findings is that access to financial resources alone did not consistently improve women's agency. Financial interventions like microcredit, savings, and business grants had mixed and often limited impacts on economic outcomes. This finding aligns with previous reviews, like on the limited impacts of credit, which found that microcredit on average did not lead to transformative impacts on income or long-term consumption, but it did help households better manage financial choices. Next, turning to household decision-making. As we know, many economic interventions for women are based off the theory of change that access to financial resources will increase women's income relative to other households will increase women's income relative to other household members. And thus, this will improve their decision-making power. We found little evidence in our review to support this theory. None of the financial interventions had strong impacts on decision-making. One exception is conditional cash transfers, which I will discuss in detail later. In many cases, gender norms played a role in limiting the impacts of these findings, and that leads us to our next finding. Thank you. Gender norms limited the impacts of many programs. While this is not surprising, we found empirical evidence of this across many studies. So for example, researchers re-examined data from previous studies in Ghana, India, and Sri Lanka to measure the impact of cash and credit grants on microenterprise profits. We found that women had similar returns on investment to men when they were the sole business operating in their household. Women in households with multiple businesses, however, experienced lower returns. This was likely the case because women directed their financial resources to their husband's business rather than investing in their own. Another example in Pakistan looked at loans and trainings for women. They found that this intervention had little effect for women's business ownership. Though some women opened businesses, they were just as likely to shut down a new business, resulting in no net gains. In this case, the study found that both men and women preferred that women operate businesses within the household rather than work outside the home. Likewise, women often chose to get business advice from their partner rather than an outside expert, even when this service was offered for free, due to gender norms restricting women's social interactions. So the next slide comes back to the cash transfer topic. I mentioned briefly that conditional cash transfers were the only economic intervention that increased household decision-making. Programs that provided mothers with cash transfers conditional on children's schooling or healthcare appear to give women greater control over household decisions. One caveat is that this evidence comes only from the Latin America context. It is also worth noting that some of these studies identified impacts in areas tied to the conditionalities of the cash transfer. So it's unclear to what extent this truly reflects changes in agency. In all, evidence shows that conditional and unconditional cash transfers have increased women's agency in other domains as well. 4 out of 5 studies across different contexts found that access to different kinds of transfer programs improved women's freedom from IPV, or intimate partner violence. However, one study in Ecuador did find that cash transfers increased emotional violence for a subset of women, particularly those less educated women who had more schooling than their partner. This is a very important concern and underscores the need to evaluate programs to understand the potential negative consequences for certain women. Conditional and unconditional transfers to women in the form of cash, vouchers, or food also increased girls' agency in marriage and childbearing. So for all these transfers programs, it is important to note that these effects rarely persisted after the transfer stopped. So how to ensure kind of lasting effects is another important issue that we want to address. And then finally, on the next slide, we find that bundle approaches that alleviate multiple constraints women face are effective to improve women's agency. In particular, economic interventions that incorporated trainings, discussions, or coaching sessions that address gender dynamics explicitly were effective in increasing women's agency in many domains. So for example, in South Africa, a microcredit program included training sessions on HIV and gender equity, and this changed women's attitudes towards gender norms. Turning to business trainings, Though traditional business trainings have had mixed impacts, business trainings that have developed soft skills or address gender-specific constraints such as self-confidence, gender equality, or self-efficacy tend to be effective in improving women's business outcomes in most cases. So in India, attending a business training with a friend strengthened women's support networks and increased business incomes among women who face the most caste-based social restrictions. We need more research to understand what aspects of these bundled approaches drive these impacts. This can also help us figure out how to deliver these programs in the most cost-effective way. With these bundled approaches, the opportunities are endless for what components are included. Ultimately, you need to understand the barriers women face in your context and program for the results that you want to see. And we're kind of excited to talk about programming and implications later on in the question and answer session.
Thank you so much, Mikaela. And we already have quite a few questions. Some of them were already answered by your remarks, but I'm sure there will be more that we can say in the Q&A portion. And I now want to ask Anna again about some of the most important challenges to consider related to measuring women's agency and some of the practical strategies that you've seen in the case studies and the tools that were shared with you by the practitioners.
Thanks so much, Diana. I've tried to summarize them on the next slide, and I'll get into some of the challenges and then maybe some of the strategies, and happy to take questions. So the first one is there's no one solution. I'm sure many of you are practitioners and you face this all the time. I think agency can't be wholly measured by quantitative means, no matter how locally appropriate and sophisticated the survey tool is or how adapted, nor can qualitative measures be the only solution, as they're limited by hyper-specificity and then therefore difficult to compare across groups. That's sort of what I was trying to say with my takeaways for each one of the cases that were presented. So we have to balance standardization and context specificity in how we measure these elements. And there are a couple of examples that do a bit of combination of both. The second one is how we measure is as important as what we measure. And in the brief, WDI, the William Davidson Institute, highlights this point really importantly. So maintaining high standards of data collection is critical while conducting agency-related research in order to maintain integrity of the process and the research subjects. And in particular, the third point is about exploring power relations and collecting sensitive data. So agency, of course, touches on issues related to power within the household, power in the community, and it asks that we interrogate questions around really sensitive topics, around choice, around family planning, these kinds of issues. So collecting data from subjects that are sensitive, it means that we need to have protocols in place to manage these potential issues. And finally, we're all still learning. The JPAL resource certainly highlights this at the end. Additional research investments are needed to better define and measure women's economic empowerment, and in particular agency across different domains and levels, capturing objective and subjective dimensions, and simply and reliably. And as a whole group of people interested in these topics, we want to make sure that these are valid across countries and different contexts. So what can we do? I would say, one of the takeaways from writing this brief is that there are lots of things that already exist. The brief intends to share some promising practices with the development community that are grappling, all of us are grappling with these issues of agency measurement. So, we would encourage you to try using the existing tools and frameworks that can be contextualized across countries and programs, and then, if possible, share your experience with others in the FinEquity community of practice and in the SEEP network, if you're members there too, what were your experiences and challenges in trying to implement these tools? Second is try and do this combination of qualitative and quantitative, standard and context specific. And as I mentioned, the WDI example has this unique combination of collecting rigorous agency-related data adapted to the local context. And they do quite a bit of adaptation in their survey questioning through pre-testing, through cognitive interviewing. And they also determine that some indicators and data collection techniques are not applicable to every population. So there's some selection process, but also it allows for maintaining some standardization. The third one would be to follow protocols. As you consider incorporating agency measurements, or maybe you already are, it's critical to have protocols in place to ensure that agency is measured well. And it's essential to collaborate with local IRBs and REBs, institutional review boards and research ethics boards, and utilize methods to ensure that they're ethical and protect the rights of human subjects, especially as we're grappling and interviewing and talking with people about these power dynamics and more sensitive topics. And then the next would be to think about the team. Again, it gets back to this, how is it as important as what you're measuring? And capacity building for teams that are going to do data collection is really important. Some of these, especially the more qualitative measures, require highly trained people with the capacity and skills to conduct focus group discussions or interviews when you're delving into household and societal assessments of agency. You could think about working with partners. We came across all of these different, more academic-oriented organizations and institutes that are working in partnership with implementers, and those kind of partnerships, I think, can be really beneficial to ensure that staff are trained, they understand how to ask these questions sensitively, considering power and gender relations during data collection, and how to, for example, stop an interview if it's needed. And then finally, as we're, in communities of practice and in networks of collaboration, we absolutely would think about this as an opportunity to collaborate and advocate, especially towards coming up with, together, consistent definitions and measurements of agency. We definitely believe, along with JPAL, that additional research investments are needed around how to better define and measure women's economic empowerment across different domains and levels, both objective and subjective dimensions, et cetera, as I had mentioned before. So I think this, I would say personally, this is something that I've talked with colleagues in other organizations about, is what can we do to harness the power of these collaborations that we have across different geographies, different organizations, et cetera, to decide what are our standards, what are our basic building blocks of how we measure and define these really important topics. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I asked Mikaela to add a little bit more, like you both mentioned, around the household decision-making aspect. And it was really interesting when I was reading the JPAL review of evidence, how, it stated black on white that conventional decision-making questions might truly not be the best way to capture household decision-making dynamics. So just to expand a little bit more on that point that I know we're all struggling with, and see what are some insights that we can learn from that review. Thank you, Mikaela.
Of course, it is something that is very challenging. I just want to echo what Anna said. She laid out the challenges and strategies so well, and I just want to talk about kind of why some of these conventional measures may not be the best. There's no easy way to do this. There's no clear consensus on the best way to measure household decision making. Most studies use survey questions, which can be subject to reporting bias and may not be meaningful if not tailored to the local context. Increasingly, researchers are using lab in the field experiments, which can better capture decision making, by directly observing the decision-making process rather than relying on a stated preference. A few studies actually use both survey questions and lab and field experiments to measure agency, and they found differing results depending on the measurements. So for example, in Macedonia, a conditional cash transfer was found to increase decision-making when measured by the lab and the field experiment, but no effects were found when it was measured by the survey questions. Many evaluations also associate women's empowerment with improvements in children's health or education. However, few studies have shown that providing financial resources to both fathers or mothers in transfer programs lead to similar results. Taken together, this leads us to question whether the use of investments in children as a default proxy for women's agency, and likewise, are survey measures actually capturing women's agency? Ultimately, we need more validation and measurement research to find the best ways to measure women's agency. And in fact, JPAL is planning to do more work around measurement and research in the coming years. And I want to also just continue to, there's so many existing resources out there. Steve has done a great job compiling them as well, and also like using these instead of reinventing the wheel on this kind of topic.
I like that, Mikaela. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. And that's why this webinar is so important, and the discussion. Thank you so much. And while we have you on camera and on the mic, can you talk a little bit more now about the applications of the evidence for financial inclusion programming?
So looking at our literature review, we want to kind of provide some implications that could help design your programs and help you design your programs. So as mentioned before, gender norms can limit the impact of financial inclusion initiatives. When designing programs, consider design features that give women more control over financial resources. These could include digital transfers, payments directly to women's accounts, or commitment savings accounts that restrict access to the account funds until a specific savings goal is met. So for example, mobile payments relative to cash give women more privacy, which can enable women to maintain control over their use. This was the case in 2 studies in Niger and Uganda. Note, however, that design features that hide decisions from their spouse may have consequences and therefore might not offer long-term solutions. So looking beyond the financial inclusion initiatives to health interventions, we saw that in Uganda, offering contraceptives to women in private rather than with their partner increased contraceptive take-up. But women also lowered women's self-reported health and happiness. And then the next slide has some other considerations for programming. First, how does programming need to adapt to a woman's life cycle? For young women, the timing of childbearing and early marriage offer key margins for improvement. While it is much more difficult to shift to household decision-making for married women, how should programs target women at these different stages of their lives? Second, how to effectively engage men into programming to enhance women's agency? Programs to change men's knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors can be effective to increase men's support for women's empowerment and reduce IPV. And finally, programs that intentionally challenge restrictive gender norms seem promising. With both these approaches, we noticed that more effective programs tended to have higher attendance from men or higher dosage of gender norms-related content. So when programming, consider how to motivate men to participate and what is the appropriate dosage. And so before opening up for questions, we had another survey for you guys. We wanted to see which of these strategies you're already incorporating into your programming.
Another poll question for you. Please answer everything, all that apply. It'll be very interesting to see which of these strategies, approaches, participants in today's webinar are using. So just a few more seconds for everyone to have a chance to answer this question. And then I'll, as we close the poll and publish the results, I'll ask Mikaela to have some initial reactions to the results, and then we can move into the more formal Q&A portion of the webinar. And I've seen already some questions. Feel free to post more. As I said, if we don't get to answer all of them live, we will follow up on our platform with answers to all of the questions. And share resources. Some of you are asking for links and definitions and additional resources. So we're gonna share all of that. So the results are in. We can see some. Yeah, Mikaela.
It looks kind of like a pretty even split, not too bad. So I think the one that popped as the top one was giving women more control over financial resources. I think it's particularly relevant for financial inclusion initiatives to ensure that not just giving funds, but actually ensuring women have control over these resources. The other two that also kind of tie together, I think this kind of just reflects the fact that C, engaging men, and D, shifting gender norms are quite related. And so it's kind of hard to do one without doing the other. Likewise, those kind of pop up the next two trends. And then a few people, 15%, are doing things around women's life cycle and thinking about how to target at different stages of women in their life. So would love to hear more examples in the question and answer about exactly how you guys are doing this, and feel free to chat it to the panelists. It'll be really great for us.
Great, thank you so much. So turning now to Q&A, please continue to post your questions in the Q&A box addressed to all panelists and participants. And maybe Anna and Mikaela will address a first one related to more on definitions. And the question says, should the definition of women's agency also include and track the perception of men about how they view a woman's role in the household and the communities? What do you think? Or have you seen elements of men's engagement or men's views in the definitions that you've seen? Maybe,
so
yeah.
Our review did not explicitly focus on interventions targeted to men, just in our search criteria, but we did see that many of the programs that were looking to empower women and girls included a component of men, husbands, parents as well. And so I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it just depends on how you wanted to focus on defining your program effects. So if that's not kind of an ultimate aim of your program, then maybe you don't need to measure it. But if you're really looking to explicitly kind of change these norms, and increasingly I think there's a recognition that women's agency is not just women's problem, and so it really involves the whole community. It involves the household and other people who have a say in kind of what constrains women in that context. So I think it's like really important to do so, but obviously programs have their different outcomes and kind of focus areas.
Yeah, thanks, Mikaela. Similarly, in our brief, it's not something that we looked at specifically, as we were more looking at measurements of different ways that organizations were measuring agency. I can say more from the practitioner perspective at Women for Women International, we have really robust men's engagement programming and are able to compare elements of the JUMP scale, the gender equality men's scale. Sorry, I forgot the name of it. But we're able to look at sort of attitudes as well as behaviors from women in the program, as well as family members and leaders in the community around the same kinds of questions around women's agency. So, from our practitioner standpoint, programmatically, that's really important, and also in terms of our measurement capability, it's really important. But it's not something that we specifically looked at in the brief. But it's a really good point and something that we can look at in the future.
Great, thank you. And there's a question on the mixed evidence about access to financial services being often linked to low awareness of the use of those services. Have you come across studies that look at the impact of active use of financial services on women's agency and empowerment, like how, if you could, disentangle all of the things that are going on, does usage, active usage, has a direct effect on women's agency and empowerment?
There are definitely studies that looked at this. Most of the time we were looking at average effects, so getting offered access to the program, not specifically among women who actively use the product. That's kind of how we focused our literature review process and kind of our synthesis research. However, I think there's definitely studies that take a subset analysis on, okay, for women who actively use these products, what kind of outcomes that we're seeing. And I don't, off the top of my head, I can't remember kind of what are the trends more promising in that way. But definitely, if you shoot your email in the chat, I will definitely follow up and can share some more specific details.
Great, thank you. Anna, did you have anything to add on this? Okay.
No, Mikaela is right, yeah.
And we'll make sure to share all these additional resources that we're mentioning with everyone. So because I'm sure it will be useful for others to learn more about those additional studies, Mikaela. So that would be really helpful.
Yeah.
All right, we have a lot of questions coming in. One of them asks whether there are any macroeconomic indicators that can help us understand a broader picture of women's agency in a particular country. And before I give you a chance to answer, I know of one, and I will ask my colleague Nisha to post the link as well. It's the Women's Business and the Law report from the World Bank. That looks at indicators related to mobility, workforce participation, and a range of legislation that prevent or encourage women's agency the way we currently understand it. But if you have other or comment more on this resource, Anna or Mikaela, please go ahead.
I would just say that the two that we looked at in pulling together the brief were, I think I probably just brushed over them quickly, were the SIGI, the Social Institutions and Gender Index, and then the UN Women data set in particular on like violence against women. But I would totally agree with you, Diana, about the World Bank Women Business and the Law. Mikaela, what do you think?
I just want to note that one of the big challenges is ensuring that there's gender data that even exists. And so I know the work at Data2X has been really kind of pushing to get more gender effect disaggregate data in national statistics. And so that can kind of help better, if we have the data there, then maybe we can have a better understanding of what these macro indicators could be.
Yeah, totally agree.
Great. And I'm going to pose two questions now, not necessarily related, but just to give you a little bit of time and decide which one you would like to answer. So one of them relates to shifting gender norms. Have you seen approaches, what approaches have you seen that work well, understanding now how much they influence, what we can expect to accomplish? And then another question for subjective measures of empowerment, the framing of the question seems to matter a lot. Local definitions of the word empowerment vary, they have different nuances. NGO definitions may dominate, and it's a complex idea. How do we know what we're measuring? And I know we've already talked a lot about the complexity and the highly contextualized, but if you can expand a little bit more. So what works on gender norms, and then a little bit more about framing questions and definitions of empowerment.
Mikaela?
So I'm thinking, Anna, do you want to start?
Yeah. I mean, the first question was outside of the scope of the brief, although I can share about, like, again, from a practitioner's perspective. But maybe I'll tackle the second one and you think about the first one, and then
I'll go the first.
And then we'll come back to it. So I think it's a really good question about how do we know what we're talking about when we're talking about concepts that might not have a direct translation in different languages or in different cultures. And that's where this sort of qualitative and quantitative combination, I think, is important. Let me just share a little bit more of the details around the AWEF example that I brushed over quickly. And they, in other JPAL resources, they promote this idea of doing qualitative research before defining these measurements around agency. And so AWEF developed this methodology based on focus group discussions at the start of the program. And the way they did it is in conversations, they talked about sort of pathways of change with program participants. So they gave the example of a typical woman and started her story. And then the participants in the focus group discussion had to describe the end of the story and what what we would determine to be agency-oriented outcomes she would like to achieve in her life. And then participants voted on which were most important and which were most likely to occur in this story framework. And so then they were able to synthesize all of that information that they collected in focus group discussions and think about what would be those most important measurements of agency and how women would see the continuation and the outcomes of this story of the typical woman, but then develop questions around that could fit that particular context. And that was kind of similar as the Jordan Valley Links project, which used CARE's gender progress markers, and they defined at the beginning what an empowered woman would look like, and then they set measures over time of that change process, and they were able to determine whether or not a woman was making gains against those measures in the change process. So they were able to really contextualize and really focus on, when you look in your community, what does that woman look like who has achieved what you want to achieve in your life, and then set those markers against them. So I thought that was really, both of those cases were really interesting, and there are links in the brief if you want much more information to the actual resources that share more about how to go about doing it.
Thank you, Anna. And just to chime in before you answer the other question, Mikaela, there are a few questions that are asking whether we asked women what an agency means for them. So this case study and example talks about, sourcing the definition, the way you measure, and what you can expect from the community before beginning the programming. So it's an excellent example for that kind of approach. Thank you. Mikaela, anything about social norms that
yes
that
we do feel like these shifting gender norms a promising area that we need more research on ultimately. So a few studies looked at kind of incorporating like a traditional business training program or financial inclusion intervention with gender dialogue groups or discussions on gender equity and other types of kind of gender norms related content, both including and without men. And they found like these had promising results. In most cases, again, like I said in the presentation, some of the challenges were ensuring that there's the right dosage, so making sure there's enough actual training sessions dedicated to these topics to be able to shift these norms, and additionally ensuring that men are actually attending and participating as well. Another program I just wanted to highlight is BRAC's Empowerment and Livelihoods for Adolescents group program, ELA, and that focuses particularly on adolescent girls. And the side of that program is that it's a comprehensive approach focused on soft skills, kind of livelihood generation. It's had different impacts depending on the context, but I think kind of illustrates the ways these programs can be designed to shift these norms around gender. And definitely I would definitely refer you to the literature review for more in-depth examples of what the kind of studies we're looking at. And then finally, another interesting topic I think are just mass media interventions. They're a really low-cost way to get information out there. And so, for example, we saw that mass media intervention, I believe in Uganda, was effective in changing norms around violence against women. And these were a short little vignette videos played within a film film festival in Uganda. So kind of exciting way to transmit this information if you're able to do it at a larger scale through mass media. Again, I just want to reiterate that we just need more research around these approaches, but definitely it's what we think is a really promising area.
Thank you, Mikaela. And just to add that the social norms working group within FinEquity, the conversations and the work and the collaboration is all on this topic. So we encourage everyone who wants to learn more to join FinEquity and that working group to engage or just see what the conversations are so far. So there are definitely these collaboration spaces where we can learn more about the topic. And one final question, as I see we're almost about at the end of the webinar, that the time we allocated for the webinar today. One last question on cohesiveness and standardization and commonalities of definitions. So as we know, not all financial inclusion funders are created equal, and for that matter, implementers as well. And some are paying very close attention to women's economic empowerment. Others are only now thinking about collecting sex disaggregated data. So are there a minimum set of indicators that we might want to advocate for within financial inclusion initiatives, indicators that look at women's economic empowerment and women's agency? I left the hardest question for the final one.
So I think from the JHL perspective, we really want to kind of hone in on the point that making sure that the information you're collecting is tailored to your local context. Having these standard indicators and that are uniform across contexts are useful to be able to kind of understand the wide swath of things, but may not mean much when you're looking at your specific context. So it's trying to figure out how to strike the right balance between these kind of minimum must-dos, if you want to say, and then also making sure that this is really important and means something in your context. I think, as always, collecting sex disaggregated data is the utmost importance in looking at these initiatives, and then kind of understanding kind of what domains of agency you're hoping to change should inform how you go about your measurement strategy. I think Anna definitely has more technique or information on that kind of measurement point as well.
Yeah, I totally agree, Mikaela, and I think that sex disaggregated data is like the floor, definitely not the ceiling. And I agree that, I don't think we certainly can't impose a standard, but I think maybe collectively in these collaborative spaces, we can maybe decide that there is a floor that's beyond just sex disaggregated data, and we can work in partnership with our donors in educating them about the work that is being done around agency measurement. And it's not so far away that it's impossible to collect, but together we can start collecting this more significantly and holistically across programming. So I would say bringing those donors along that are a little bit reticent, educating them, and then maybe together in these collaborative spaces, we decide what is the minimum of what we want to collect and report against.
Well, thank you so much for that cue. What I was going to say next within FinEquity, and you can see on the slide, and we will also just want to reiterate that we're going to share these slides. We're going to share a recording of the webinar, and we're going to share answers to some of the questions that we didn't get a chance to answer live on our platform, D Groups, and to you directly. So follow the discussion on D Groups, but also within FinEquity, we are now developing our work plans for next year, and this is one of the things that we want to take forward within the data and measurement working group on common minimum set of indicators, minimum must-dos, like Mikaela is saying, cohesive ways of defining and measuring agency and women's economic empowerment. So I invite everyone who's interested in following or engaging with the topic to join FinEquity. And I know the SIP Women's Economic Empowerment Working Group also is working on similar aspects. So these two spaces for sure are available to everyone who would like to engage further. And this is a priority for us in the next year. And before we close, we have 2 questions for you on how useful and whether you will use the information from this webinar in your work. So it's another poll question for everyone who is participating. If you can please take a second to answer these 2 questions for us, will help us as we organize future webinars. And while you do that, I also would like to thank our presenters, Mikaela and Anna. Wonderful job. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing these insights. And I know I will